fortress that once held some of the most notorious criminals in American history. For nearly 3 decades, this high-security penitentiary was known as the end of the line, a place where escape was nearly impossible, and freedom was just a fading memory. Surrounded by freezing waters and deadly currents, Alcatraz was designed to break the spirits of the men who ended up there. But even in its darkest days, Alcatraz was never just a prison. It was a battleground of wills, where inmates tested their limits against an unyielding system. Guards maintained a constant struggle for control, and daring escape attempts became the stuff of legend. Its walls may no longer hold prisoners, but its history is still alive, whispered through the empty cell blocks and the rusting bars. The story of Alcatraz is one of crime, punishment, resilience, and mystery. Long after the prison closed, its legend has only grown, captivating people from around the world. This is the story of the Rock, its rise, its reign, its greatest escape attempts, and the legacy it left behind. Alcatraz, one of America's most infamous prisons, sits on a rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Surrounded by cold, churning waters and strong ocean currents, the prison was designed to be inescapable. For decades, it housed some of the country's most dangerous criminals, earning a reputation as the ultimate fortress. But Alcatraz was more than just a prison. It was a place of psychological torment, where isolation and strict discipline shaped the daily lives of its inmates. The prison's high walls, barbed wire, and ever-watchful guards created an atmosphere of despair that made Alcatraz one of the most feared penitentiaries in American history. The island itself had a long history even before it became a prison. Originally mapped by Spanish explorers in the 18th century, Alcatraz was later used as a military fortress, and then as a military prison before being converted into a maximum security federal penitentiary in 1934. It was chosen for its remote location, making escape nearly impossible. For the U.S. government, Alcatraz was the answer to rising crime and the growing problem of hardened criminals who refused to be controlled by traditional prisons. The facility was meant to break the spirit of those who ended up there, and for many, it did exactly that. Alcatraz became home to some of America's most notorious criminals, including Al Capone, the gangster who ruled Chicago's underworld, and Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. These men, once powerful figures in the outside world, found themselves powerless within the prison's concrete walls. Life on Alcatraz was strict and monotonous. Inmates spent most of their time in small, cold cells, with limited privileges and little human contact. The guards maintained an iron grip on the prison, enforcing silence and discipline. The harsh conditions led some prisoners to madness, while others spent years plotting their escape, dreaming of freedom that was nearly impossible to attain. Despite its fearsome reputation, Alcatraz was not immune to attempts at defiance. Over the years, prisoners made numerous escape attempts, though most ended in failure or death. The strong tides and freezing waters acted as natural barriers, ensuring that very few ever made it off the island alive. Guards and officials constantly reminded inmates that even if they managed to get past the walls, the treacherous waters would seal their fate. However, the legend of Alcatraz was built as much on the daring escape attempts as on its strict confinement. The prison's history is filled with stories of men who refused to accept their fate, adding to its legacy as a place of both hopelessness and resilience. For many Americans, Alcatraz remains a symbol of justice, punishment, and mystery. Though the prison closed decades ago, it continues to captivate the public, drawing visitors from around the world. Its story is one of power and control, of those who enforced the rules and those who tried to break them. The cold, steel bars and empty cells still whisper tales of the men who lived and died there, making Alcatraz one of the most legendary prisons in American history. Alcatraz Island, long before it became the notorious federal prison known as The Rock, had a history shaped by its strategic location in San Francisco Bay. Initially discovered by Spanish explorers in the late 18th century, the island was named La Isla de los Alcatrazes, or the Island of the Pelicans, due to the large number of seabirds that inhabited it. It remained largely untouched until the mid-19th century, when the U.S. military recognized its potential as a coastal defense site. With its steep cliffs and remote position, Alcatraz was an ideal location for a fortress that could protect the bay from potential naval attacks. By the 1850s, the U.S. Army had built fortifications and positioned cannons on the island, transforming it into a key military outpost. As military technology advanced and threats of foreign invasions diminished, Alcatraz's role as a defensive structure became less relevant. Instead, the island's isolation made it a prime candidate for a prison. In 1861, during the Civil War, the military began using Alcatraz to house Confederate sympathizers, political prisoners, and soldiers who had been convicted of serious crimes. Over the next several decades, the military prison grew in size and reputation, with its facilities being expanded to accommodate more inmates. By the early 20th century, it had become a well-established military detention center, known for its strict discipline and harsh conditions. The cold, damp air and strong currents surrounding the island made escape nearly impossible, reinforcing its status as a place of no return. By the early 1930s, America was in the grip of the Great Depression, and crime rates were rising. Infamous gangsters, bank robbers, and violent criminals roamed the country, many of whom had proven to be too dangerous or too cunning for standard prisons. The U.S. government needed a solution for housing the most uncontrollable offenders, those who continued to influence crime from behind bars or who had repeatedly escaped from other institutions. In 1933, the Department of Justice took control of Alcatraz, and the following year, it was officially converted into a maximum security federal penitentiary. Unlike other prisons of the time, Alcatraz was designed to break the spirit of its inmates. The facility operated on a system of absolute control, with guards enforcing a strict routine that left little room for individuality or comfort. The prison cells were small, measuring about 5 feet by 9 feet, containing only the bare necessities: a bed, a sink, a toilet, and a small shelf for personal items. Prisoners spent most of their day in isolation, allowed only brief periods of recreation in the outdoor yard under heavy supervision. Meals were silent, and communication between inmates was restricted. Even within the same prison, prisoners were often kept separated to prevent them from conspiring together. The prison's administration took pride in its reputation as the most secure facility in the country. It was surrounded by frigid, fast-moving waters, making escape attempts nearly suicidal. Guards were armed and well-trained, patrolling the prison day and night, ready to suppress any sign of rebellion. Alcatraz also featured a strict privilege-based system, where good behavior could earn inmates small rewards, such as access to books or music. However, those who violated the rules faced immediate punishment, often in the form of solitary confinement in the dreaded D Block, where conditions were even more severe. Some of the most infamous criminals in American history were sent to Alcatraz. Al Capone, the notorious Chicago gangster, arrived in 1934 and quickly realized that his money and influence held no power within the island's walls. Accustomed to bribing officials and living in luxury, Capone found himself reduced to just another inmate, stripped of any special treatment. His time on Alcatraz was marked by illness and isolation, and he spent his final years there battling the effects of syphilis. Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, was another famous prisoner. Though he was an expert on bird care and had kept birds while incarcerated elsewhere, He was not permitted to have any animals during his time on Alcatraz. Instead, he spent his days in strict confinement, often reading and writing about prison reform. The prison also housed men like George Machine Gun Kelly, who had terrorized the Midwest with his gang, and Alvin Creepy Karpis, the longest-serving inmate on Alcatraz, who was a key figure in the infamous Barker Karpis gang. These men, who once controlled vast criminal empires, were reduced to isolated figures living under constant surveillance. The idea behind Alcatraz was not just to incarcerate, but to completely neutralize the power of the criminals who had defied the law time and time again. Despite the strict control, maintaining Alcatraz was expensive. The harsh environment took a toll on both inmates and staff. The salt water corroded the buildings, requiring constant maintenance. Supplies had to be shipped in regularly, making operations costly compared to other prisons on the mainland. The isolation also affected the mental health of prisoners, many of whom suffered from severe depression, paranoia, or violent outbursts. Some inmates attempted suicide, while others turned to self-mutilation as a desperate form of escape. Throughout its years of operation, Alcatraz remained a symbol of ultimate punishment, a place feared by criminals across the country. While other federal prisons had occasional riots and outbreaks of violence, Alcatraz maintained its reputation as a place where resistance was futile. The island's rigid structure and psychological warfare kept most inmates in check, ensuring that the prison remained one of the most secure institutions in American history. However, its iron grip would not last forever. By the early 1960s, the prison's costs were becoming unsustainable, and the public was beginning to question whether such extreme isolation was necessary. While Alcatraz had successfully held some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, it had also become a financial burden. Other prisons were being built with more modern security systems, making the expensive upkeep of Alcatraz less justifiable. The prison's days were numbered, but its legend was far from over. The stories of the men who lived and died there, the ones who plotted their escapes, and the ones who endured years of solitude continued to capture the public's imagination. Even before it closed, Alcatraz had cemented itself as a place of myth and mystery, a fortress that held America's most infamous criminals behind its cold, unyielding walls. Alcatraz was designed to be inescapable. Surrounded by the icy, fast-moving waters of San Francisco Bay and guarded by some of the most heavily armed officers in the prison system, it was meant to break the spirits of its inmates. For most prisoners, the reality of their confinement set in quickly. The walls were too thick, the guards were too watchful, and the water beyond the island was too treacherous. But for some, the desire for freedom was stronger than the fear of failure. Throughout the prison's history, a handful of daring men risked everything to escape, defying the odds in attempts that would become legendary. One of the earliest and most dramatic escape attempts occurred in 1939,